The Fish by Jane Hirschfield. There is a fish that stitches the inner water and the out of water together. Base them with its gold bodies flowing, a heavy thread follows the transparent river, secures it. The broad world we make daily give ourselves to. Never imagined, nor unimagined, neither winged nor finned, we walk the luminous seam, knot it, flow back into the open gills.
I have many hobbies, but one is particularly weird. Yet I devote many hours and much head scratching to it. I dream about this hobby. I have bled for this hobby. You know what I was doing before church this morning? Working on this hobby. I'm going to describe this hobby to you. I take a large, completely useful item, I reimagine this item, I do a bunch of math, and I write out all of my work, and I even check it. My mother couldn't even get me to do this in grade school. When I cut up these completely useful items into pieces of varying sizes, then I put them back together again into something similar to the original form. And then I force these newly created items onto other people. It is the most bizarre thing. Why would I devote money, not to mention hours every week, decades of my life to this strange behavior? Why not just leave the useful item in its original form? Some of you may have witnessed me partaking in this hobby or seen the products of it. I am a quilter. You may have gotten that from the photos and the slides of some of the quilts that I have made. Now you're probably like, oh yeah, quilts are great. They're pretty and keep me warm. They hold many memories. Someone who loves me made me one once. Long ago, making quilts made sense. People, mostly women, used small pieces of cloth that they had. From worn-out shirts or dresses or linens, they would sew them together to be larger pieces of cloth, and then sew those together into a quilt so that they could be useful. At first, this was done purely out of utility. But then, those making the quilts started to get creative, and an art form emerged. Many, actually, because there are an incredible amount of techniques and styles to sewing a quilt. In this day and age, however, when you get down to it, making a quilt is a bizarre act. It's one done with love, it takes a lot of time, but it's also unnecessary. Unlike knitting or crocheting or weaving, which turns yarn into cloth, the supplies for making a quilt these days typically starts out as cloth, then gets diced up into pieces and then reassembled back into cloth. Quilters often start from whole sheets of cotton, defeating the original purpose of a quilt, to reuse and repurpose every scrap of fabric. I have always been drawn to art, working with color and making things. My brother and I grew up with major rules around TV watching and computer usage. We had no cable in our house, and it was before the time of carrying around a computer in your pocket. But we had a big art supply cabinet where the sideboard in the dining room should be. Our dining room table was often cluttered with all sorts of creations in progress. I made my first quilt in middle school. My mom had taught me how to sew both by hand and on a machine. She and I had worked on projects together, but this quilt I made when I was 13 was my first without direct adult involvement. Support maybe in checking the math, since at the time I seemed unable to do so. Since then, I have dabbled in other handcrafts. You name it, I've probably tried it or researched it. Beading, basket weaving, embroidery, bookbinding, paper making, stained glass, tie-dye, macrame. I have 2 floor looms. Think medieval torture-looking device that each take up the same space as a dining room table. I have 4 sewing machines. I know what tatting is. Do you know what tatting is? There's always one. And what about your punto? My most recent learning has been the fundamental knot of Oya needle lace, a Turkish-style lace making. It kind of looks like a very fine netting. Why learn this? Well, why not? That was for you, Bruce. Some of these experiences are a one-time thing, and I tuck the learning away to maybe transfer to something else. Some of these skills I practice, and they stick around for a while. Some I set down, and then they resurface years later. But quilting. Quilting is the foundation of all of my making. Quilting is what I come back to time and again. Quilting feels like home. Now, here is where things get deep, and I finally get to the point of this long, detailed story about my cereal crafting history. On many levels, our church kind of reminds me of making a quilt that is never finished being made. Our founding members were a part of a church, or a piece of cloth, if you want to carry on this metaphor, which we do. They then broke off to form their own congregation, starting the foundation of a new quilt. Sometimes we look at our quilt and we remember where each piece of fabric came from. That print reminds us of when we called Reverend Laura. That texture reminds us of our old building. To keep our quilt functional, we add patches to mend holes so that the batting, that's a sheet of stuffing that goes in between the quilt back and the quilt top, doesn't come out in tufts and our quilt doesn't fall flat. Sometimes we have to replace whole pieces in order to make our quilt complete after a transition. And sometimes the change is so great that we have to rip apart the seams of our quilt in order to put it back together again in a new configuration. To do this, to trust that we will be able to put ourselves back together again, we bring all of our different experiences, skills, and passions to this place, sewing ourselves into this newly imagined design. In her book, When Things Fall Apart, American Tibetan Buddhist nun Pema Chodron writes, "Things falling apart, or in the case of our quilt metaphor, being cut or seam ripped apart, is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart again, then they come together again and they fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, for relief, for misery, for joy. When we think that something is going to bring us pleasure, we don't know what's really going to happen. When we think something is going to give us misery, we don't know. Letting there be room for not knowing is the most important thing of all. We try to do what we think is going to help, but we don't know. We never know if we're going to fall flat or sit up tall. When there's a big disappointment, we don't know if that's the end of the story. It may just be the beginning of a great adventure.
Then I cut up these completely useful items into varying sizes, and then I put them back together again into something similar to the original form. Why not just leave it in this useful item in its original form? I'll tell you, we've been talking about it for a long time, but we are in an extraordinary time. That original form just feels like it's a little elusive now. Sure, some of these things were predicted and changing before the pandemic. We already had a president who used us and them language in dangerous ways. We already had rising visibility and legitimization of ethnic nationalism. And we knew that women and trans people's rights and their ability to determine their own health care were under attack. We've been told for decades that religious life in America has been in decline, although secretly we as Unitarian Universalists would be immune to the trend, I think we believed, having hopes of capturing the imagination of the nuns, those who identify as spiritual but not religious. In the fall of 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association convened the Article 2 Study Commission with the charge of propose any revisions that will enable our UUA, our member congregations, and our covenant communities to be a relevant and powerful force for spiritual and moral growth, healing, and justice. Proposed changes, they said, should articulate our core UU theological values. The charge continued, the commission is charged with reviewing all sections of Article 2 and is free to revise, replace, or restructure them as needed to meet the objectives stated above. There is nothing sacred in the number of principles or sources, nor their specific wording, nor in the way that Article 2 is laid out. We encourage creativity. That's on our UUA level, and on this congregational level, we too have gone through a lot of changes. Some which were already in motion before I joined you 8 years ago, like looking at improving the Oakley Drive building as our previous church home or finding a new building to purchase. The name change conversation started before the pandemic. Change was already in the air, even though we may have been unaware or in denial a bit of both. Anna spoke of how sometimes the change is so great that we have to rip apart the seams of our quilt in order to put it back together again in a new configuration. To do this, to trust that we will be able to put ourselves back together, we bring all of our different experiences, skills, and passions to this place, sewing ourselves into this newly imagined design. I believe that's kind of an apt metaphor. Way to go, Anna, where Merging Waters is today, and that you are not alone. This week, I'm going to join my colleagues at the UUMA, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association Ministry Days. This year, unprecedented, they pulled together a context statement in preparation for our assembly. It's kind of a position statement to place a kind of starting place for our learnings and conversations. So listen to this. I pulled out a few excerpts. This year, we're structuring our virtual ministry days to create a place for important collegial conversations about particular dimensions of ministry in our current context. Our goal is not to lament what has been lost, though we do believe that spaces and places are needed to lament what has been lost in our vocation, but rather to embrace what is and share and dream with one another about the exploration and innovation we all need to be engaged in now and in the future. They continue that many of the things that clergy learned in formation 20 or 30 years ago about how to fulfill our roles needs to be updated in this changed landscape. Sounds kind of like churches in a way as well. Many observers, they say, have noted that we are living in liminal times. I know that's a word we're all sort of tired of. We need to learn new practices to equip us for the emerging future. And this was kind of their closing statement. We cannot expect things to return to the way they were. While some congregations are thriving in ways that look familiar to us, the landscape in which we now practice is undeniably different than it used to be when some of us came into ministry. There's no map to guide us, but together we can explore, innovate, reflect on what we are discovering, and find our way forward. I say this just so that we can understand kind of the layers of what is going on here. So I guess there is no way to escape the inevitable. I guess we all have to embrace what is. We as ministers and you as a congregation will all need to dream with one another about the exploration and innovation we all need to be engaged in now and in the future. We can do this. We come from a history of change and innovation. I was recently reading a book called Theology Ablaze by Tom Owen Toole. He writes this about Francis David, who is attributed with being the founder of the Unitarian Church in Transylvania. It was reported that during the great debates of the 16th century Transylvania, folks scoffed at Francis David for being so changeable. Look at David, they taunted. He starts out Roman Catholic, then he becomes a Lutheran, then a Calvinist, and now he calls himself a Unitarian. What will he conceivably be tomorrow? To which David was reported to have said, semper reformanda, or always reforming. He continues, synonyms, this is Tom speaking, not Francis David. Synonyms for semper reformata have multiplied during the past 50 years of our consolidated association. Consolidated association, he's talking about when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1961. He says, whenever surveys have been taken in our Unitarian Universalist fold, various words and phrases pop up. such as quest, transformation, search, metamorphosis, growth, changing ourselves in a changing world. Perhaps metaphors of chicks hatching, creative projects, and spools of yarn hold wisdom for this moment. From the poem Tangled that Anna read earlier, but sometimes I hold the tangle in my hand, amazed for a moment at the complexity, the mess. I look at it and I think, this can't be solved. It just is.
One more quilt story for you. Well, I have many. I think I should write a book, but I'm going to limit it to this one. I was working on a quilt during the pandemic. I worked on many quilts during that time because it was my way of easing my anxiety about the constant churn of the unknown. But this one particular quilt had a few arbitrary parameters around it I had set to challenge myself. Parameter number 1, I needed to work in yellow. I had realized that while I love the color yellow, much of our house is painted yellow, I avoided working in yellow. Parameter number 2, as much as I could, I needed to use fabric that I already had. Quilters often amass a major fabric stash. We buy fabric that is too precious to ever cut into. We buy supplies and equipment because it's better than what we had before, even though what we had before worked just fine. Case in point, me having 4 sewing machines. Can I sew on 4 sewing machines at any one time? No. Does each sewing machine have specific magical abilities different from the others? No. It's a weird demonstration of capitalism and consumerism at its finest. So use what I already had. Parameter number 3, whatever came out of this project was going to be entered into a quilt show. A goal of mine for many years that I kept putting off. To start making this quilt, I pulled all of the yellow fabric that I could from my stash. For someone who didn't work in yellow, I had a surprising amount. I found other fabric to go with it, started cutting fabric and putting it together. And I hated it. Rarely do I dislike a project enough to completely stop, but this one, ugh. I stepped away from it for a time, periodically coming back and poking at the fabric and then walking away again. And then in my quilt daydreaming, I decided to scrap the original design and just play. I pulled a center block of a 20-inch by 20-inch red flasher butterfly foundation paper piece that had been rejected from another project. I dug out some square and a square blocks from a project that never really got finished, that I had intended to look like roses. Butterflies and roses made sense. And I piled on the yellow pieces that I had been cutting. I started putting things together, not looking for perfection, trying to quiet the critical mind that always looms. I will say there was a lot of math involved. Even after writing down all of my work and checking my calculations, I still had to pull in my mother to help figure out how everything fit together. The final project is wild, a riot of color that clashes. It's bright, it's bold. It did not win any prizes at the quilt show it was entered into. But the point wasn't the product. The point was the process, the play, the exploration, and the letting go of something that wasn't working and reimagining what could be.
I really loved reading about Anna's quilting process. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. I have a feeling that many of you may have similar experiences with creative endeavors, whether it's carpentry or music or gardening or cooking or engineering or parenting, who knows what, the list goes on. It was when she decided to scrap the original design and just play with the red flasher butterfly. That was like the moment for me, something that she had rejected from the past she brought into this project. Peggy Clark, the minister at the Community Church of New York, the one who wrote that I'd spoken about during our gathering together about the congregation falling in love with the 2 o'clock worship time, much to her surprise. She wrote this about ministry, and I think it applies to all of us. What skills will we need in the new world? This is a very important question, and one that I ask myself often. I think we'll need to learn how to let go of expectation, how to live comfortably with ambiguity, and how to hone our instincts for innovation. Anna reflected on her project after letting go of the original plan and parameters. I started putting things together, not looking for perfection, trying to quiet the critical mind that looms. She likes those little puns. The final project is wild, she says, a riot of color that clashes. It's bright, it's bold. I didn't win any prizes at the quilt show it entered into, but that wasn't the point. The point was the process, the play, the exploration, and the letting go of something that wasn't working and reimagining what could be. So I'm hopeful that this potential collaboration and relationship with the United Church of Christ in New Brighton may end up being the butterfly, who knows? Something that cracks open a new way of seeing, of coming together. And I admit that after an incredible amount of work over the past few months by our exploratory team, that I was in conversation with the team at UCCNB, me and Katie having a lot of conversations and culminating in those 2 meetings last week, my own critical voice was looming. It wasn't until I had this beautiful conversation at the Fridley Parade with Liz Haworth, who's on the board and was part of the exploratory team, that my perspective shifted and my energy returned. We talked about this practice of what we do when we gather on matters of interest and importance in this congregation, the practice of when we pass the mic. Everyone's equal. Everyone has a voice. Everyone in the ideal world is heard. It's kind of awesome, really, when you think about it. And it's messy. We get our first responses, often unfiltered, certainly not considered for a period of time, studied, reviewed, or discussed with others. We were contrasting how different that is than when you're in a large congregation, and you get information, and then you leave the meeting and you head out into the parking lot and chat with a couple friends. This is a very, very different process. This potential 2-year commitment, if you guys choose to do it, and if they choose to do it, it could be a moment of rebirth of sorts. And I have to admit that I am constantly in a state of renewal and rebirth. I believe that's important for us as human beings. Mark Nepo reminds us that from the view of the chick, it is a terrifying struggle. The chick must feel like it is dying, yet everything it has relied on falls away, and the chick is born. It doesn't die, but it falls into the world. Transformation always involves the falling away of things we have relied on. So as Liz and I talked about how extraordinary this process was, and is, to hear from everybody, to be open to what we hear, and potentially to be willing to be changed by what we hear. I have seen this process a number of times. You have too. We've done it when we talked to the architects about the Oakley Drive building. We talked it this way when we decided to sell the building and changing our name. Boy, those conversations are initially sometimes hard to hear. They're sometimes hard to take in. Sometimes I remember at one of the name change conversations where merging waters, I think 5 or 10 people were like, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. And then the mood changed a little bit, and I think a bunch of us were like, oh my God, what have we done? And now I gotta say, a month later, I'm like, wow, that's a beautiful name. And I actually tell people the name of our church, and they're like, wow, that's a beautiful name. So it's kind of like, oh, this process, man, it is messy, 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 and it's incredible, and it's incredibly egalitarian. I think the conversation last week is just part of this process, and we will hear your thoughts again this week after sitting with it for a bit, for the thought of change. For me, I kind of just keep returning to the beauty of that sanctuary and the joy of the openness of the people we've worked with over at UCC New Brighton. I do really kind of believe this could be the butterfly that refocuses and reshapes all that surrounds it and comes together as something bold and bright that might serve you and our faith in the near future. That is, if you approach it knowing that there's going to be hard parts, that require some calculations. I had no idea quilting involved so much math. I will not put that on my list at all. And that there's also this opportunity for you to let your spirit be creative, to play, to be in joy and beauty, and to help you embrace the unknown and welcome the future.